Here, we wish to provide an account of the ideas of René Guénon, who was regarded as the proponent of integral traditionalism. Guénon is regarded as a teacher and the founder of a school, and in France has come to be accepted by the official and academic culture, albeit with various reservations. Guénon's work is complex, but also forms an organic whole. Firstly, it formulates a radical critique of the modern world, a critique that differs from that of various authors of the past and the present, to the extent that it has a positive point of reference, the world of tradition, of which the modern world is the antithesis. The term traditional refers to a universal type of civilization which, in varied but analogous forms, was realized more or less completely in both the East and the West. Traditional civilization, Guénon affirms, has metaphysical points of reference. It is characterized by the recognition of an order higher than all that is human and contingent, and by the presence and authority of elites that draw from this transcendent plane the principles and values necessary to found a well-articulated social organization, to open the paths to higher knowledge, and finally, to give life true meaning. At the opposite pole lies modern civilization, which is defined by desacralization on a grand scale, by the systematic denial of all that is superior to man as an individual or as a collective group, by materialism, and by the impulse to realization in the sense of productive activity on a purely secular and temporal plane, an insane activism. Two books by Guénon, Crisis of the Modern World and The Reign of Quantity and the Sign of the Times, contain the essential elements of this critique. In those two works, themes already discussed by various authors of the past and the present acquire a particular sharpness and a firmer foundation. The same critique is formulated in the book East and West, but there it is associated with other questionable claims. While Guénon recognizes and cannot fail to recognize that civilizations of the traditional type have existed in both the East and the West, in this latter work he claims that they are now only found in the East, especially India, and that taking them as a point of reference may be an effective means of Western reintegration. Now, this claim may at most be valid with regard to Eastern esoteric doctrines, but certainly not for the factual reality of the East. Guénon was convinced of the existence in the East, in spite of everything, of groups that were still depositaries of the tradition. In practice, he had direct contact with the Islamic world, where initiatic veins still exist parallel to the exoteric tradition. Guénon makes no mystery of the fact that, after several disappointing experiences in French occult circles, it was thanks to exponents of Eastern doctrines that he managed to find the right path, that of the initiatory or metaphysical knowledge. These esoteric teachings are the stated or implied foundation of the doctrines expounded by Guénon in several books, most notably the symbolism of the cross, the multiple states of the being, and man and his becoming according to Vedanta. Here, one of our reservations is that often what Guénon presents as metaphysics in a special transcendent meaning is, in fact, aside from differences in terminology, essentially not very different from what goes by that name in the history of Western profane philosophy, and often ends up in rather tedious abstractions, as for example in the case of all the expositions on universal possibility and the like. Nevertheless, a point that remains valid is that the rational is not the extreme noetic limit of man, and that the normal human condition can be removed, since man does not represent in fact more than a transitory and contingent manifestation of true being. Thus, in principle, it is possible for him to strive towards a higher plane in which knowledge signifies being the thing known, so that in knowing, the individual transforms and integrates himself. The ancient concept of gnosis is analogous to this. Initiation, he claims, is the most direct and regular path to such a realization. Guénon clearly differentiates it from anything that is mere mysticism. Tradition, in a first sense, refers to all of this metaphysical and not merely human knowledge. It admits of a variety of forms while remaining in its essence one. Concerning its unity, Guénon also speaks of a primordial tradition, a concept that had been formulated before him. There are hints of it in the Mestre, in Fabre d'Olivet, and in a way it was also accepted by the Catholic Wilhelm Schmidt in his remarkable work on Idea of God. With regard to the concept of primordial tradition, one must, however, distinguish between a metaphysical aspect and an historical aspect. The former concerns forms that are related in ways that are not the result of material, historically verifiable transmission. A single law can give rise to distinct but corresponding and analogous forms, in the same way that in several points of a stream of water, separate whirlpools with the same morphology can form as a result of the same law and similar situation. Regarding the second aspect, it is the result of a concrete first origin common to a complex of traditions. Guénon accepts the idea of a Hyperborean tradition placed at the beginning of the cycle of civilizations, of Indo-European civilizations in particular. This idea had already been affirmed by other esoteric authors, but also by profane authors like Hermann Wirth, who in his vast work of Uneven Value, The Rise of Mankind, tried to establish a basis for it. All this leads to the thesis of the transcendent unity of traditional forms, and in particular of the transcendent unity of religions, as Fridtjof Schoon, a disciple of Guénon, calls it. One of the abilities attributed to one who has risen to the level of higher knowledge discussed earlier would be that of glimpse that unity, as well as, conversely, to be able to express a given content in terms of one or the other tradition, just as a concept can be expressed in the words of one or another language. Guénon has shown himself to possess this capacity beyond what can be attributed to mere erudition. Guénon again uses traditional ideas in his criticism of the modern world. He has no doubt that we are today approaching the end of a cycle, that we are in the Kali Yuga, or the Dark Age predicted by ancient Hindu doctrines, but also in other traditions, Hesiod's Iron Age, for example. He rejects, then, every form of progressivist delusion. Progress outside of the material domain, where, however, it often comes at a high price, is for Guénon merely a superstition of Western men. Guénon interprets history in decidedly anti-Marxist terms, as an involution, indicating its real meaning in terms of the so-called regression of the castes. The reference point here is the traditional articulation of society into four castes or functional classes. At its summit, the exponents of spiritual and sacred authority, then the warrior aristocracy, then the bourgeois, and finally the working masses. Now, a society governed by the first caste recedes into almost mythical remoteness. The subsequent reign of the second caste ended with the decline of the great monarchies. Then began the reign of the third estate, of the bourgeois, of industrialism and capitalism. Finally, what corresponds to the fourth caste emerges and has begun its struggle for world domination, Marxism and communism. Any anti-Marxist interpretation of the course of history from the right should refer to this essential scheme, which we have ourselves developed on several occasions. One of Guénon's theses is that a normal, therefore traditional civilization would be characterized by the primacy of contemplation and pure knowledge over action. This is also one of the foundations of his critique of the modern Western world, where he finds the very opposite, namely the primacy of action. But this is precisely the point at which we must begin to formulate certain reservations. Our critique can take as its starting point the indication of the characteristic nature of the power at the apex or center of traditional civilization. It is not correct that it was occupied by elites who cultivated contemplation or pure knowledge in more or less priestly terms. Historically, this was not the case even in India, for despite its predominantly Brahmanical civilization, it had royal dynasties and representatives of the warrior caste who possessed traditional knowledge. In fact, the aforementioned apex is characterized rather by an undivided unity of sacredness and royalty, of spiritual authority and temporal power. Aside from ancient China and a number of other ancient civilizations, Japan has almost up to the present time maintained itself at that level, and it is significant with regard to Genon's idiosyncrasies that he never referred to Japan and its specific traditional character because it did not correspond to his scheme. While Genon notes the completely desacralized and deviant character of the modern West, this has not prevented him from considering the problem of the possibility of rectification of a redressment. Based on his conviction that if the West has had a tradition, it was in Catholicism, he believed that the starting point of such a rectification would have to be in an integration of traditional Catholicism, not ruling out the advantageousness of contacts with Oriental elements. But even before the recent trends of post-conciliar Catholicism would reveal the reality of the situation, he did not entertain too many illusions in this regard. He also explicitly stated as much in a letter he wrote to us, confessing that as a matter of principle, he had felt compelled to not exclude certain possibilities, without, however, actually expecting any results. The only real result has been that thanks to Genon, several Catholics have come to penetrate the deepest meaning of Catholicism, of its symbols and its dogmas. Unfortunately, these individuals have no power in the official hierarchy, which would allow them to exert any significant influence. On the other hand, a Catholic theologian would probably detect incompatibilities between the truths of orthodoxy and all that is derived from the metaphysics which Genon refers to. Genon was allergic to politics in the narrow sense, claiming that there was no currently existing movement he felt he could support. In any case, Genon belongs in essence to the culture of the right. His work is a radical negation of democracy, socialism, and individualism. He goes even further into areas barely touched upon by current right-wing critics. He opposed traditional knowledge and traditional sciences to modern science and scientism, not hesitating to rehabilitate the former once their true meaning had been clarified. Not only did he point to the limits of profane scientific knowledge, but also to the devastation that inevitably follows from its worldview and its applications. One statement by Genon succinctly sums up the meaning of the adventure that Western man has devoted himself to since the Renaissance. He has detached himself from the heavens with the excuse of conquering the earth. We can also quote the Far Eastern saying that the net of heaven has large meshes, but no one passes through, indicating the play of concordant actions and reactions that led to the current Dark Age. Aside from what he believed was possible for an integrated Catholicism, Genon indicated the rectifying action of intellectual elites. Here, he may have had in mind the kind of influence once exercised, but in an opposite, subversive direction by the so-called thought societies, up to the French Revolution and in the margins of Freemasonry. Even if Genon does not use the term intellectual in the current sense, and even though he is not referring to today's intellectuals, but to a conservative and traditional form of intellectuality, the concept remains somewhat abstract under current conditions. If anything, to us a more adequate conception would be a kind of order bringing together personalities loyal to certain principles rooted in traditional spirituality, but also more directly in contact and in confrontation with reality and historical forces. Such an order would make up the bone of a true right, and if its members, without necessarily flaunting their connection with the organization, were gradually able to occupy certain key positions in contemporary culture and society, a rectification would be possible. All this only in principle, because today's environment and men are such that initiatives of this kind would have little chance of success. As a fallback, there remains more or less what Guénon had in mind: the formation of centers of traditional intellectuality with an activity that, realistically, would be limited to the cultural domain. Even such an activity should not be underestimated. Today, it has become quite fashionable to speak of a culture of the right, but without it being clear what it is supposed to consist in, and without it being possible to avoid the feeling of something improvised. However, there does seem to be favorable soil, and the various publishing initiatives confirm this. In this context, a use, but not a slavish one, of Guénon is desirable. Given the variety and multiplicity of subjects treated by him, it would be well, however, to leave aside those that are specially concerned with esotericism, metaphysics, and initiation. Although they are the ultimate foundation of everything else, given their unusual nature, there is no need to put them in the foreground, thereby possibly alarming a certain circle of readers and providing pretexts for ostracism. Of course, apart from the intellectual aspect, there is the existential aspect. Traditional knowledge, as has already been stated, is necessarily at the same time realization. The Nietzschean axiom, "man is something that can be overcome," is also the axiom of esoteric knowledge, which, as we have noted, starts from the idea that the human state of existence should not be hypostatized. Only one must indicate how to prevent distorted, mistaken, or dangerous applications of this postulate. This is not an appropriate place for particular considerations of this domain of realization, which would entail an examination of Guénon's book, Perspectives on Initiation. We will simply note that there are reservations that must be made with regard to the possibilities almost exclusively considered by Guénon. He insists on the necessity of a connection with a given chain, with a given regular organization transmitting a spiritual influence. For clarification, an analogy would be the consecration of a priest by a bishop, who is the administrator of the spiritual influences of which the church is believed to be the custodian. In the case of Guénon, this connection must mainly have been realized, as we have already stated, through Islamic chains. But to those who do not feel like turning to Muslims and Orientals, Guénon offers very little. However, the theme of integral traditionalism can be detached from this problem and be used in the formation of a culture of the right.